to the Security Lab podcast.
Taiwan. Let's get back to Taiwan and it being what do you call it, single point of failure. Well, besides the semiconductor industry, from what I understand, also during the last conversation or chit chat that we had, you talked about how some pretty important submarine cable routes actually pass by Taiwan. Also, can you share? That?
Yeah. Look. That's. I kind of feel like I'm here to bring bad news about everything I'm doing. I want to be positive and not depressing. But the submarine cable issue is actually worse than the microprocessor one. Taiwan and China are still happily shipping chips to the rest of the world, and it's the occasional COVID outbreak hurts this, but that's about it for the moment. But in terms of the world of submarine cables, it's a no-no already. The Taiwan Strait's always been a terrible place for submarine cables because it has a lot of earthquakes. So they get broken all the time by earthquakes. And as a result, insurance companies have always been a little funny about cables that are in the first place. They're always a little tetchy, can't you go somewhere else? Well, no, because behind the Taiwan Strait, there's 1.2 billion people. And there aren't 1.2 billion people anywhere else, so that's why we need to send the cables. The issue we've got, of course, now is that effectively America has prohibited submarine cables landing in Hong Kong. That's specifically the issue. And the Taiwan Strait is where they traverse. So it's not specifically an issue about the Taiwan Strait as such. It's an issue about the geopolitics of that region. Now, the problem there is that they retrospectively applied the ban. So Google and Facebook spent hundreds of millions of dollars landing cables in Hong Kong, only to be told, you're not allowed to use them. And it's like, oh, okay, what can we use? Okay, well, in the case of one of the cables, it stops off in the Philippines on the way. So they said, oh, okay, you can go to Manila. Okay, well, that's not where we actually want to go, but you can go to Manila. And then the other cable, which was affected, stops in Taiwan. So it's like, okay, you can go to Taiwan. So what's effectively happened is that Hong Kong is now dead as an international telecommunications hub when it comes to new fiber cables. Everyone is desperately trying to get out of there. And initially what that has meant is that Taiwan and the Philippines have become de facto hubs for East Asia. So there were record capacity sales, literally 10 terabits plus of capacity sales in Taiwan and the Philippines last year by Telstra in Australia. And then rerouting around this constraint of not being able to go directly to Hong Kong and using existing cables to get into China in other ways. Now, so that's the first issue. It's becoming incredibly hard to go through the traditional hub of Hong Kong. But there's another issue as well, and it's in your part of the world. Singapore has exactly the same issue, and it's for a different reason. It's because Singapore's surrounded by the waters of Malaysia and Indonesia, and they've introduced rules, what they call cabotage rules, where basically if a Singapore to America cable breaks, that happens in Indonesian waters, there has to be an Indonesian ship that repairs it. And ditto, if a Singapore to India cable breaks in the Malacca Straits, it has to be a Malaysian ship.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, that's been a big issue in Malaysia in the past few months. I'm sure you're aware of it. What it effectively means is that the people who want to build cables to Singapore from both west and east, who are, we'll name them, Google, Facebook, and Amazon, right, can't get insurance. They can't get investor backing. They can't even guarantee supply. Okay, so this is also causing an issue for Singapore as an internet hub for Asia. You have, and it's a completely separate issue to what's happening in the Taiwan Strait, but it has the same end impact, which is that people in Southeast Asia and East Asia, their use of the internet in terms of data is growing 30-40% every year, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to build new cables into those countries to service all that demand. And specifically, it's an issue for the traditional hubbing centres of Singapore and Hong Kong. So you are now getting, I hope no one in Australia hears this, because I'm about to say something which is going to upset some people, but you are now starting to get some absolutely crazy ideas to deal with this. There's a little speck of an island called Cabotage Island, which is like 1,400 kilometres south of Sumatra, and it's got 100 people on the West Island and a big runway and 400 people on the East Island. They're now seriously proposing this as a new cable hub to replace Singapore. So we'll land all the cables from India, Singapore, Australia, Africa there, and that will be the meeting place. Right now, as you can imagine, an island with 400 people on it doesn't necessarily have like the most reliable power grid or governance, rule of law, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So, but this has actually been seriously talked about in the submarine cable industry, and it's actually a measure, I think. And I hope no one from the Cocos Islands is watching this, because if you are, I'm sure you have a lovely, lovely place to live. But it is not a viable choice for a submarine cable hub to service the Indian Ocean and all of Southeast Asia. I'm sorry, it's not. But this is being seriously proposed right now because of the concerns and the risks around Singapore and Hong Kong.
So Doc, but if not that, what else can we do? What are the other alternatives there could be? You know?
Well, it's an interesting question, because it's a problem for Singapore primarily at the moment. And if Singapore complains about Malaysia's cabotage rules or Indonesia's cabotage rules, they don't actually get much of an audience, as you might imagine. It's not landing submarine cables isn't the sort of thing that preoccupies the minds of political establishments, regrettably, but it tends not to. There has been an interesting debate in Malaysia about it, because there are some people in Malaysia who do see the downsides of what's happening, and I've seen some quite interesting discussions there where people are saying, hey, it's all very well to protect our local shipping industry and give them work, but think of all the benefits of the digital economy we might miss out on if we miss out on new cables. So there has been a very interesting discussion, and a pretty realistic, mature adult one by the sounds of it. But it is an issue going forward, because as we've been talking about for this entire podcast, people are becoming increasingly concerned about risk, and that this is what it's all about. It's about risk.
Yeah, that's right.
And submarine cables are a big manifestation of that. I can't even imagine what is going to happen when all these LEOSat networks go up as well.
NeoSat?
People worry about national sovereignty.
Yeah.
Between SpaceX, Amazon, Telesat, LeoSat, OneWeb, that's just 5. There's another 10 or 15 I could name. In fact, I'll give you a number. There's currently 2,500 satellites up there in space.
Yeah.
But if all these satellite networks come to fruition, there'll be 50,000 satellites within a matter of years.
Yeah.
All trying to communicate with internet signals to every single person on Earth.
Yeah.
Okay, so that creates some interesting sovereignty issues and interesting things like spectrum management and why the country do I allow all this?
What you're sharing is scary. I'm gonna be honest with you.
Yeah, it may be scary. It's just unknown. It's unknown what this will mean. In terms of having all these largely American companies with thousands of satellites over our landmass and seeking the right to participate in our communication economies as if they're local telcos. And it's a very, very interesting policy conundrum that a lot of governments have yet to face up to.
Yeah, that's true. But anyway, I want to thank you, Graham, for bringing up the matter about the Cabotage. I remember reading about it, and then I just did not follow up with it. So I was wondering how it panned out. But from what you said, it sounds like they haven't come to they haven't agreed to allow foreign shipping companies to repair submarine cables.
That's right. That's right. Or even install them. There aren't enough submarine cables to justify each country maintaining fleets of multiple ships to repair them in case they break. It's inherently something where you spread that cost over many countries. That's the issue. And of course, you end up with, if you say only an Indonesian ship or Malaysian ship can do it, again, you have that point of vulnerability where there may be only one ship that can do it.
Yeah. From what I remember,
that's where the problem comes from.
Yeah, from what I remember, there was like some kind of a body or association that is like that makes the rules about this kind of things, and then the company that owns the Malaysian owned ship is also a member of that particular organization or association.
Yeah.
And, the gripe is that the ship which they own is currently at a certain at a level which is not enough to be able to do the repairs.
Yeah, that's right. It can only do certain types of cables, but not all of them, and perhaps not the more modern ones, which and this is the other complication with subcables, is that it used to be you just put 2 or 4 fiber pairs in a cable. But I spoke to someone here in Australia last week who's developing a plan for a cable system to be built in about 4 or 5 years. He wants to stick 10,000 fibers in one cable, up from 2 or 4, 10,000 fiber strands in one cable. So if that breaks, you've got to re-splice every single one under the water. So that requires a sort of certain, like a quantum leap in your surgical skills when you're repairing a subcable. So that's the sort of type of issue. You can't just use any old boat. There's quite specialized skills and technology. But just as a quick aside, one of the interesting things about this cabotage issue is that China doesn't actually have a cabotage requirement right now. So Alcatel can sail a foreign flagged vessel into Chinese waters and repair a cable right now. But there is a fear, this is the fear, that they will implement a cabotage law because Indonesia and Malaysia have one. So it's like, oh, they've got one, let's have one too. This is a good idea.
Okay.
And there's a real fear in the subcable industry that this is like a submarine cable version of COVID that will become very contagious and everyone will have the idea this is a good thing, and then it's going to become impossible to build new internet capacity. And that's a real issue, obviously, in East Asia, where everything's maritime. And of course, incredible amounts of population live in island nations. So, there's no way around. You have to have submarine cables. There's no other way to get there.
Yeah. So it looks like the future of internet looks very bleak right now. And then there's the potential of satellites above us, and
maybe they'll be our saviors. Who knows? When everything else fails, you'll still be able to get a connection to a satellite. It's not so much. I like to be a little bit more positive here. Talking about this is a good thing because you can't solve a problem unless you identify it. And there's far too much, oh, I can't talk out of school in the tech industry, in the telecom industry. I don't want to offend someone, or I can't talk about this, it's too sensitive. But if you don't talk about these things, you don't identify the issue. You need a critical mass of people saying, yes, I want to diversify my supply chain. And it's only when you have a critical mass of people doing so that someone is incented to build a foundry in Europe, or to have a little tap on the shoulder and say to a country, hey, about your little law protecting local shipping, it's going to cost you $50 billion of digital economy upside if you don't do something about it. And you need to have these discussions. But if you don't, that's when you actually have the problem. So the problems are more theoretical than actual for the moment. If we talk about them enough, then something hopefully good can.
Okay.
I agree with you. I think at this point, data is a very important asset that we have, and protecting it should be of utmost priority. But unfortunately, this is somewhere uncharted, less known and less understood part of the structure. I mean, we have moved a lot where technology, we've come a long way. But now defending something where, we are still moving around, and there is a saying that I can think of now is, you touch the stones as you cross the river.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get it?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So I think this is the, it's not bleak. It can be exciting for the adventurous one, knowing that you have something important to look after, We may injure ourselves a little bit, but it's something that we recognize we have to do.
Yeah.
So it's not that big after all. And as you rightfully put it, when you have a problem, then we have to put it out instead of keeping it underneath.
Exactly. Rather than succumb to it, deal with it, confront it. We all have to be grown-ups. That's how I sort of look at it.
Now, about the question about all the cables going through an island, today, if you look at the cable networks, whether it's Asia Pacific Cable Network, APCN, which goes through Taiwan, Hong Kong, and then back to San Jose, or if you're using CME-V3 that goes the other route through India and all that, the cable networks have to eventually land and pass at some point of time. Example, Trinity Cable passes through multiple countries completely controlled by Google. Now, we all know Google's mantra of do no evil, but we also know it otherwise, right? So then the question is, does it really matter where the infrastructure goes through? Because we've seen reports of how cable networks are actively being tapped, intercepted, irrespective of whichever route they go through. So, for example, if someone goes through, South China Sea, then anyone who has access in the sea would still be able to technically tap the cables. So, effectively, what is the risk that we are looking at, and how do we then rationalize against our existing setup that we have today? We already have multiple cables. Your traffic goes through multiple carriers even before reaching destinations. And to some extent, the big content guys are already having whatever data that you have. So how does this change the perspective of data connectivity and looking at supply chain attacks against a global infrastructure such as internet?
Okay. Is that for me to answer, or?
Yes, Grahame.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very interesting question, and you're coming at it from a slightly different angle to me, because I'm not a security guy. I'm looking at it from an economics point of view. Am I missing out on the ability to transport bandwidth because I can't get a specific cable to land in my territory? So I'm looking at it from that point of view. But you raise a very interesting question. The question was actually framed around whether Cocos Islands should be a hub for Southeast Asia and India. And I'd hasten to add it's Australian territory guarded by Australian Defence Forces. So, there's a lot of countries that might not want a cable to land specifically there because it may be tapped.
Five Eyes.
I'd say you're adding someone who's a country that's part of the Five Eyes Alliance to Pan-Asian networks. That would be of concern to national security agencies in many countries, I suspect. But your point's absolutely valid. A lot of the taps, it's actually relatively difficult to tap a modern submarine cable under the ocean. It used to be a lot easier. It's become a lot harder. There's much more to multiplex. There's a lot more armoring of the cables now. They're much more secure, and there's so much data, it becomes harder to process. So the points of vulnerability these days, it's as far as, this is not me speaking, but what the telecom industry regards as point of vulnerabilities, are sort of what you just identified there, which is, the underlying people who light the fiber pairs, we don't do any evil type companies, but of course, they might not. There are some people who might not necessarily agree with that self-assessment, and it's often what's happening at the head ends and at the points of interconnect. And that goes for another place that's a big interconnect hub for Asia Pacific, and that's Guam, which is an American federal territory. A lot of cables are interconnecting and originating and terminating in Guam. So yeah, I actually agree, I totally agree with you. There are many, many points of vulnerability, and but not being able to land a cable is an economic issue, perhaps more so than a security issue, given all those other points of vulnerability.
Completely agreed. But I guess from a national perspective, if you look at the perspective of the countries, they would normally take the route of most efficient or economically efficient route. And the reason being is because they would want to keep the cost of getting to internet as low as possible.
Yep.
While we're seeing the amount or the cost for bandwidth per gigabyte going down over the years, it's still fairly expensive for some of the smaller, less economically prevalent countries.
Yeah.
Hence, if you look at from that perspective, they really don't have a choice. If
yes, that's right. Yeah.
Working in that country, you'll be affected. So, for example, I've been in operator line for 20 years. I've done interconnectivity locally as well as globally. So one of the challenges we've had, for example, say we use Myanmar as an example. A lot of terminating cables from Myanmar has to go through Thailand because they're still the biggest hub from that side down southwards. So if you look at it, sometimes what we also find issues is a website gets banned in Thailand and that gets cascaded down to Myanmar because they are interconnected indirectly. So, in that sense, there's still that democratization of how internet is, and that's still a challenge because you don't have independent route out. Someone can do that at a country level or can do that at an IX or an internet exchange level, and all these internet exchanges are interconnected to each other. Hence why we also have problems like distributed denial of service attacks, DDoS. So it's I don't think there's a straightforward way of doing it. I guess everyone would naturally look at the cheapest route, the most viable route, and some countries still prefer heavily satellite connectivity simply because of terrain issues. For example, in Afghanistan, they use satellite communications a lot because if you lay a fiber, the Taliban will use it, will ransom you, and if necessary, they will blow it up.
Yes,
I've had the lucky or unlucky experience of being there to look at the infrastructure, and that's the reality of the situation. So it varies from country to country. So what do you think about that, Grahame?
No, it's a very interesting question. I just want to start slight digression to what you're asking me. Make an observation that almost all the big submarine cable infrastructure in Asia is financed by what I call web scale companies. Google, Facebook, Amazon. They're the ones who buy the fiber pairs on the proposals, and it's their yes or no decision that makes or breaks whether the cable gets built. So, it's a very finite set of companies that are often dictating which cables get built and to where and by whom. Asia Pacific indigenous telcos with the next layer, so the Singtels, the China Telecoms, and so on. But most of them are at international levels of giantness. If you get my point, they're multi-billion-dollar conglomerates who are putting money into these things. So the issue you've identified is when you get down to the next tier, the Myanmar Post and Telecommunications Agency does not punch at the weight required to be able to swing some of these investment decisions. And for better or for worse, and I talked about this a minute ago, there's quite a big reliance on maritime connections for international connectivity in Asia. Almost everything is done by submarine cable in terms of big amounts of bandwidth. You are correct, there's still some satellite in the mix in some places. But one thing that perhaps needs to be looked at a little bit more, and where some countries could perhaps become masters of their own destiny a little more, is to build terrestrial fibre optic cables connecting countries. And Southeast Asia's been able to do this in things like railways and roads. There's the proposal for the Great Asia Highway going down from China to Singapore, and similar with high-speed railways. There's work on that front. But as far as I'm aware, and I would be happy to be wrong on this, but as far as I'm aware, there's been no work done on building a terrestrial fibre backbone using some of those rights of ways that you could get from railway and road routes across the borders. And Myanmar to Thailand, Thailand to Laos, to Cambodia, to Vietnam, and so on. And I think there's an enormous opportunity there for Asia-Pacific, Asian telcos and Asian internet providers to take back control of their own destinies from the Facebooks and the Googles, and perhaps control some of their own traffic and interconnect a bit more. I'd love to hear all your collective thoughts on that.
Enjoying the show so far? Subscribe now so that you don't miss out on the latest episode. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many other platforms. Visit podcast.securitila.asia to get the links to subscribe.
I guess the reason why, based on my experience, the reason why we do submarine cables is because of the destination of where the traffic goes. So we do traffic analysis to identify, say, for example, 60% goes to US. Then the priority would be for the cables and the bandwidth to be allocated so that majority of the traffic goes to US. Yeah. Now, the Asian conundrum is a bit interesting because, number one, you have local content. So, for example, if you're Myanmarese or you're from Thailand or you're from India, you are bound to consume more local content as compared to, say, the likes of US or anyone else. That's why you see the giants like Amazon, Google and everyone else setting shop in these countries because there's a big enough market to serve, and that the content is localized so that the adoption of these contents become much higher. And the same thing with China. So if you look at it, they are very predominantly local language centric. Example,
local providers as well, but also local providers. Facebook and Google and the global web scalers aren't playing in China in a big way. It's indigenous companies.
True. So, for example, I quote India. You have Amazon, you have Flipkart, right?
Yep.
You still see a decent amount of sales in these two platforms. And the reason being is because they've localized it to that particular geographic location, as compared to, say I'm buying from Amazon US to buy a couple of books. That's a different story because Malaysia and Singapore, example, would be predominantly English content. There's no driver for local content. And the thing is, because of the difference in the local language, then what happens is it doesn't make sense for my traffic to go through 5 countries before it reaches US or it reaches UK. So, for example, if I'm browsing to bbc.co.uk, it doesn't make sense if my traffic goes through Thailand, India, and whatnot, Middle East, and then it ends up in BBC. Hence, if you look at the topography of how the fiber connectivity is, it gives you, quote unquote, a direct link passing by minimal stops before it reaches, say, UK or before it reaches US. So you have a landing point in Hong Kong or Taiwan, and then you're straight at San Jose. So which means that I have that speed. This makes sense if there's a lot of Asian shared content. So for example, if I'm a Malaysian content provider, I create content specifically for Thailand. I produce Thai series or movies or horror stories. Then it will make sense for the countries to actually share the infrastructure. But you're absolutely right. There is this opportunity for inter-country fibers, countries that are neighboring each other, to have direct fiber connectivity. It also helps from a resiliency point of view, because if the submarine cable gets dropped or for whatever reason gets cut, you can still reroute your traffic, have a transit agreement with your ISPs, and then push the traffic out. So from a resiliency perspective, that works awesome. But if you're talking about speed and experience, then you're going to have that speed crunch.
Yeah, well, and this is, and you're absolutely correct, and this is why there is a perception of an issue with being able to not being able to ensure new submarine cable builds in both the Straits of Malacca, the Sunda Strait, and the Taiwan Strait, because that's what people want. They want that fastest, cheapest, most direct link. And this is the issue that's agitating a lot of people in the subcable industry right now. They're being compelled to kind of help an island ring out, whether it be the east side of the Philippines, Taiwan, Guam, or even Australia. And if I could just put a little bit of colour on that, the government of Chile, I'm sorry, I know you didn't expect to be talking about Latin America in this conversation, but the government of Chile wanted to build a cable to Asia, and they had a look at all the options, China, Japan, They've ended up deciding to build it to New Zealand, because all the advice they got was it's just too hard to build cables into East Asia right now. So build it to New Zealand and Australia, go up to Guam, go up to Japan, and there's 100 terabits of spare capacity from Perth to Singapore right now that's already built. So use some of that. Don't build your own. So this is something that I agree with you. I think if I'm in downtown Santiago in Chile and I want to do something quickly with a customer in Shanghai or Tokyo, I really don't want to go through Auckland, Sydney, and Perth and Singapore to get there. It's crazy. But that's actually what's happening. And that's why there is some concern in the subcable industry. They don't see this as a desirable situation.
Yeah, absolutely. But I guess back to our focus on supply chain type of attacks, like what you mentioned earlier, is that it's getting more difficult to tap into underwater cables because of the shielding. I've had experiences in the past where the sharks seem to think that fiber cables are like candy, so they go chewing on them, and it's interesting to read the reports coming in and say, oh, our ship is already docked, we can't go out to the ocean because it's raining, and this goes on for weeks at end. And I'm sure that Prof and Kat has had that experience where internet becomes crawlingly slow because we experience cable cuts due to the typhoon in Taiwan and Hong Kong. So it's a pain. But I'm happy
just as a funny aside, we had a similar situation here in Australia, whereas of course there's thousands of kilometres of empty desert. So the easiest and cheapest way to route a fibre optic cable was down the old telegraph poles that go down the highways, because we have a rather large bird here called a cockatoo, and cockatoos love eating cables and they love sitting on telegraph poles while they're doing it. So we've ended up having to bury fibre optic cable across thousands of kilometres of desert for no reason other than to stop the cockatoos from eating them.
Yeah. And I also think that the type of infrastructure that you use for internet has to gel with where you put them. So, for example, if you're going to plant fiber optics in a country that has a lot of earthquakes, you're bound to get a lot of fiber cuts.
Yes.
And the same thing, yes. So that's why we have varying types of technology. And I guess over time, technology starts improving. Hopefully there's an alternative to fiber. I think right now everyone is just looking at fiber as the all end all solution for bandwidth, but that's still something to be seen. But
yeah, look, it's interesting to say that, and we were talking about satellites a minute ago, and I think I mentioned the statistic that we're going to go from 2,500 satellites to 50,000 satellites, which is an incredible jump. But probably what I didn't really illustrate is that those 50,000 satellites can do a lot more bandwidth per satellite than the 2,500 old ones. So even the sort of slightly stodgy, old-fashioned geosats, the new ones going up can support 200 gigabits a second at the same time, which is effectively, if you consider that 400 gigabits is the state of the art of a wavelength on a fiber optic cable, you've got half a wavelength on one satellite. There's 50,000 of these things going up. So it kind of gives you an interesting. I don't think satellites will bridge the divide in terms of data capability of fiber, because fiber is also progressing very fast as well. But for a lot of countries, a couple of satellites serving 200 gigs, 400 gigs, whatever, that's going to be an incredible fillip to what they've got now, and particularly in terms of affordability.
Okay, I'm going to pull you back to security. I love talking about telco. Unfortunately, it's one of my passion as well. I probably want to start another show just on telco stuff, but that's for another day. Now, if you look at today's technology that we use a lot of encryption. We use TLS 1.3 to secure our data. So does supply chain attacks from an internet infrastructure perspective still a threat? Because if you look at it, the likelihood of the current technology being broken probably is not publicly known. Maybe it's there, but to the general public, our existing cryptographic capabilities, be it on the wire or on the data, is still fairly secure, provided you follow all the base recommendations and all that. Now, that said, would it make any difference if someone were to have their ear on the wire or on the fiber listening to your data?
I don't know what it's like in Malaysia, but in Australia, as of last year, it's the law for all network operators and device manufacturers to provide a decryption capability to the Australian government. The law doesn't specify how to do it. The law does say that if you don't do it, you go to jail. So, conceivably, the Australian MD of Google or BlackBerry could end up behind bars if they don't provide the decryption capability. So it's a very interesting question, because my instincts tell me, which I suspect are yours as well, that with modern encryption, it's incredibly hard to tap stuff. And, if I use Signal, for example, I should feel incredibly secure in what I'm doing. But you also just made a very good point about the kind of the unknown unknowns. And we don't know. What's what we don't know? Which the government's putting out in a press release, they're requiring this decryption capability, but they don't tell you the content of the conversations they've had with these network operators and device manufacturers subsequent as to how to effect this capability. Now, a lot of people in the security community here laugh at this law and say it's impossible. How can you mandate this? But the fact is, it's a law, and how they apply the law is not something they discuss with mere journalists like me. So unfortunately, there are question marks. There are question marks over some of these things at the moment.
I could offer some explanation based on my experience. If you look at the traditional plain old telephone system, POTS or GSM, in the system and in the specification, the LEA requirements have been baked in.
Yeah.
Which means it's a known fact. Right? If you take out the 3GPP stack, you can actually see them having specific interfaces for law enforcement agencies.
Yes.
That's from a infrastructure perspective. Now, if you look at internet and applications per se, you don't have that specification as yet.
Yeah.
So example, if I open a browser and I have a TLS 1.3 connection to my bank, then I know for a fact that that session is secure. although it passes by my telco and then goes to the telco, the bank, and then goes to the bank, that connection is secure because it's end-to-end between my browser and the bank. No one can see it in between. Now, the only other way is if you perform attacks like a man in the middle, or if I spoof the certificate and I somehow manage to install my rogue CA cert into your device, or your device says, yeah, this is protected, you should browse it. Now, that's a different kind of perspective altogether.
Yeah.
But that granted, the current technology is safe for us to assume that I am using my secure connection to the bank so that I can make withdrawals or make payments, and I have that level of comfort.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The internet doesn't play that rule with governments, because if you look at 3GPP and all that, the standards are heavily influenced by governments, by regulatory bodies, for them to have these kind of provisions built in.
Yes.
And by rightfully used in the correct context to combat crime and to check on terrorism and everything else, all fine and well. Now that's also a two-catch sword, because whatever that's used by the good guys can also be used by the bad guys, right? But I guess the bottom line is, internet works slightly different in its own variable ways. I recall in World War II, there's a typewriter called Enigma.
That's right.
The only way they could actually crack the code was when they got a copy of the machine and they realized how the ciphers were working.
That's right. Yeah.
So you use that same analogy today. The internet and the applications are somewhat like Enigma machines on their own. They work on their own ciphers. They work on their own strength and technology. So it kind of goes against the regulatory framework, which is why my question earlier was that, with all the current technology that we have, end-to-end encryption and all that, from a layperson perspective, forget about the guys, the techies, the cryptos like me and all that. Forget about us. The average man on the street, my mother who's using WhatsApp to give me a call, what does it mean to them?
No, but very, very little, actually. And their security is better than ever from the point of view of, am I being hacked by someone who wants to use my credit card number, for example? Of course, those things still aren't perfect, but they're a lot better than they used to be. But the ability to intercept and decrypt obviously is now something that's in the hands of state-based actors. And that has concerns not for the man in the street, that is true, not for your grandma, but for some particular individuals, it's definitely a great concern. And that's why it's become such an issue here, particularly with journalists, because journalists know that they're the types of people whose communication is going to be read.
We should probably have a discussion on, what journalists could do differently to protect their source, encrypt their data, and if you're in a country that is in a conflict or currently in some sort of a military rule, that's probably a discussion for another day. But that would be an interesting discussion on, how could these people protect themselves better? What could they do differently? What has the existing cases that we've observed in the US with Capitol Hill and all the other episodes teach us about operational security, and what could the good guys do in a better way to protect themselves?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to say that, because like with most things, it's always interesting to see how organized crime deals with these issues, because they tend to be at the cutting or the bleeding edge of these things. And of course, what organized crime did was to populate niche encrypted services, and perhaps a quite famous one was Phantom Secure, which was an encrypted service that came out of Canada, which used modified Blackberries and impossible to eavesdrop on. So it became the preferred communications medium for drug dealers in Australia. So rather than try and decrypt the Phantom Secure network, Australia simply made it illegal to own a phantom secure modified handset. And if you have one, you get arrested and you go to jail. So that was their way of dealing with that. Just ban the use of the device if you can't decrypt it. And I mean, I know I'm sounding a little bit facetious there, but this is what we are seeing increasingly, and not just in terms of security, but simply the communication tools of democratization and communication often just get banned outright if they become problematic. And we've seen that in India with Twitter in recent days, and we obviously saw that most recently in Myanmar.
Yeah, so there seems to be a trend of heavy censorship when something goes wrong in the country or something is about to happen, something major like an election, for example.
Yes.
And that seems to be the trend.
That's right. Even in America, New York Post couldn't tweet something before the election. The president, I believe, couldn't tweet before the election either. But yeah, there's I mean, and that's obviously digressing slightly from what you're talking about. But I'm making a broader point there, which is when governments feel that particular technologies get a little bit out of their control, they're not subtle about what they do in reaction. And I guess that's the point I'm trying to make.
Okay. So I'm going to pass the mic back to Kat and Prof. Maybe they might have some burning questions to go through with you.
Nice to talk to you.
It was very technical, very interesting. I learned a lot from the conversation. I realized that I want to get myself a Phantom Secure modified handset. Thank you.
I don't think they're banned in Malaysia, so
so it's still allowed in Malaysia. So there's an opportunity for us, especially journalists, to get it. Prof, anything from you?
No more. Thanks. I'm still digesting what I've learned today.
Yeah, digesting. Jeez.
Thank you so much, Grahame.
Thank you, and very interesting to hear all your perspectives as well. And I want to restate yet again, I'm not a security guy. I come at it from another point of view, which is sort of telco and the internet and the economics of, or network economics, actually, is how I would put it. Security is not my forte. But I'm rapidly learning that perhaps I need to know a little bit more about security because it's clearly becoming a pretty big issue.
Yeah. Sure, but I would really love to have you again in the show. I think your insights have been really, really profound, and I guess Prof and Kat would agree with me that we really value your inputs, and I guess looking at it from a down south perspective gives us a different view of how Asia is from a lens of the internet, the connectivity, as well as the cybersecurity.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, it is all becoming increasingly relevant. These topics don't exist in silos anymore. As I mentioned, national security issues are colliding very directly with things like the production of semiconductors and the ability to lay a submarine cable across the Pacific Ocean. And the two worlds are becoming quite entwined. And I find myself talking to security analysts, and I don't mean network security, I mean national security, people who worry about cold wars and that kind of thing. I find myself talking to those types of people more often than not now to understand what's going on in telecoms than traditionally, and Kat will be able to relate to this, a product manager from Ericsson or Huawei might have been where I usually went to get my understanding. No longer is that the case.
Thanks for joining us this week on Security Lab. Make sure to visit our website at securitylab.asia, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show.